Jean Barthet was a French milliner who first rose to prominence in the 1950s as hatmaker to Hollywood and French film stars, also designing hats for films such as The Young Girls of Rochefort. Barthet helped to define fashionable hat styles, including the bucket hat, pillbox hat and fedora, that predominated throughout the 1960s and collaborated with major couture houses. With a career spanning more than 40 years, he remained a favorite hatmaker of Sophia Loren, both for film and personal wear, also creating hats for Michael Jackson's 1988 World Tour. Jean Barthet was born in Ney, a village in the Pyrenees region of France in 1920, although he would later put his date of birth as 1930. After studying at Art College in Toulouse, he left for Paris, working for the milliner Gilbert Orsel before setting up his own salon. Barthet presented his first collection in 1949 and soon attracted an international clientele. Notable among them were many Hollywood stars. He introduced hat styles that attracted newspaper publicity, including a white felt hat, inspired by the Texas sheriff's sombrero and a feminine variation on the fedora. By the early 1960s, his clients included Jacqueline Kennedy. By the mid-1960s, such was his client list that the Chicago Tribune said Barthet had more star-quality customers than any Hollywood studio ever had under contract. These included names such as Sophia Loren, Natalie Wood, Bardot and Princess Grace of Monaco. His collaborations with haute couture houses continued from his early career into the 1980s, and he worked with among others André Courrèges, Chanel, Claude Montana, Paco Rabanne, and Karl Lagerfeld. He collaborated with another notable milliner, Parisian-born Claude Saint-Cyr, who worked with him from the mid-1960s to her retirement in the early 1970s. Examples of Barthet's hats are in a number of public collections, including the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 2011, a vintage Barthet hat featured in a Lady Gaga shoot in Vanity Fair. In 2014, reproductions inspired by his original models were created by his son Alexandre Barthet for the biopic Grace of Monaco. Barthet was also a keen photographer, and his extensive photo archive includes portraits of musicians, actors and fashion designers, some of whom are captured wearing his hat designs. The hat-wearing requirement from previous decades was drastically subsiding in the 1960s. For the young, the formal hat was seen as old and outdated, a throwback to a more conservative time with a lot of rules that no longer applied to them. Therefore, most dressy hats in the 1960s were worn by mature women, who embraced the traditional etiquette rules of wearing hats to match the occasion. Young women and trendy fashion followers did wear some hats, usually with two-piece suits or wool dresses in winter. Summer sun hats and straw hats were also still fashionable for all ages. Hat styles in the 1960s mimicked hairstyles, large, bouffant, round-shaped, oversized cloche hats that stood up tall on the head. Small hats such as the pillbox and non-hats like the net whimsies continued to be worn throughout the decade. These small hats hinted at the idea of a dressy hat, yet they worked with 60s hairstyles instead of suppressing them. New textured fabric and straw manipulation created dramatic hats out of unusual materials. Flower petal hats are one iconic example. Shaped like upside-down flower pots covered in bright petals, they were perfect Easter hats. Feathers, net, marabou, and other puffy materials were sculpted into unusual hats. The peak of hat fashions were in 1964, the same year My Fair Lady was released. The film sparked a fad for wide-brim picture hats. Vogue reported, "Paris is riddled with pretty hats this spring, never have we seen so many and never, never, never have we been more tempted." By the mid-1960s, most women were reducing their hat fashions and increasing their clothing budget. The affordability of clothes made buying multiple hats to accessorize small wardrobes a thing of the past. Women were now buying multiple dresses, suits, and casual sets, with only one or two hats for the entire year. The fast fashion youth purchased cheap hats for certain outfits and tossed them away when the next fad came along. They favored colorful vinyl bucket hats, cloches, and rain hats. In winter it was the knit beret, oversized newsboy hat, Dutch boy, or Russian Nureyev cap that put them in gender-bending casual looks. Marked by sweeping social change, the 1960s is a decade that still holds a special significance, seeing traditional hierarchies begin to dissolve and make way for the birth of the modern age. The way people dressed was an obvious sign of shifting attitudes. In the 1960s, many chose, very publicly, to start looking different from the norm. Innovative designers and more informal modes of shopping drew a dividing line between the generations, creating a new market for youth fashion. And one of the pioneers of this complex historical process was Jean Barthet.